Hebrews 2, verses 14 through 16. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death. That is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death.
Amen. Amen.
Now, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were truly a prophet, he would know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other owed him 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he cancelled the debts of both of them. Now which of them will love him more?" Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt cancelled. "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume over my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little." Why was Jesus so threatening, particularly to the overtly religious? How could Jesus, so gentle, meek, and mild, be threatening in the first place? But to the overtly religious, you'd have thought the opposite was true. If anything, you would have thought a message of doom and gloom and national destruction, get your act together, or the entire nation is going to end up walking off the cliff that you're set upon walking off. You would have thought a message like that would have sounded more threatening to the ungodly, to those who were on the outskirts, the peripheral of religious life, those who were hiding from God, blatantly hiding from God, in a lot of cases unashamedly hiding from God, those whose sins, their problems, their struggles were worn right on the end of their sleeve. Their life, like this woman, was so notorious, everybody knew who she was. You would have thought it would be those people who would have found offense in the things that Jesus had to say. You know, the sinners, those types. And yet, whilst being tougher on sin than anyone else ever before him, or anyone else since, Jesus found himself constantly surrounded by sinners, favorably surrounded by sinners. No one was stricter on sin than Jesus. Pluck out your eye, cut off your hand. If you lead any of mine into sin, be better for a stone to be put around your neck and you cast into the sea than for one of you to lead one of mine into sin. But by and large, it was the outskirt folks, the peripheral people, who most rallied around him, who walked for hours just to hear him, who tore the roof off of a house just to get to him, those who left his presence dancing with joy, and even defying his direct command to keep silent about what he'd done for them. Which is arguably, it qualifies for one of the most hilarious scenes in Scripture when this happens. That when Jesus heals a certain man or a woman or whatever it is that ails them, and they say to Jesus, thank you, thank you. And you know, they're just about to go off down the road skipping with joy, saying, I can't wait to tell them. And Jesus says, oh, hold on, no, wait a minute, I don't want you to tell anyone. Huh? I don't want you to say a word. No one? Yeah, no one. All right, Jesus would have said, you got it? Got it. No one. Okay, thanks, Jesus. Hey, you'll never guess what Jesus That is joy on a whole different level. When you defy the direct command of the one who made you well, without even a thought, wait a minute, if I defy the one who healed me, he's obviously got the power to give me it back. But to defy the explicit order not to tell anyone is a joy that it could not be contained. It's the impossible command. In fact, sometimes I wonder why Jesus even bothered telling them. Has not God, observes James, has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith? He's not declaring a biblical truth. He's not even really declaring a truth. It's a question. It's an observation that James has made. In fact, he asks it. It's a question. It's not God. It's an observation by James that he's obviously garnered over the years by seeing who it was that typically revolved around Jesus and who it was that was typically responding to the message that they were sharing, and then watching them as they would go out and spread the message and then spread it with joy. Even when they beat us, the text records, when they beat us, our reaction was to leave the council rejoicing that we had been considered worthy enough to suffer. Even when they beat us, the more pressure they added to us, the happier we got. We must have drove them insane. And why? Why was that the typical reaction? Well, forgiven much, loved much, has a lot to say about that, yes? Those who have been forgiven much, love much. Jesus says those who have been forgiven little, typically, love little. Which is why, incidentally, the gravity of our sin and the enormity of our debt must be appreciated, must be grasped. Because if all we think that God has done for us is forgave us a few bucks, well, even I can do that. What type of response does that warrant? When's the last time you ever ran all over town telling someone your friend forgave you 20 bucks? It doesn't solicit the correct response. Jesus' response to Simon at Simon's house is to tell Simon that what he's witnessing as the woman weeps over his feet and then utterly humiliates herself by letting her hair down in public in order to dry his tears, and then pour perfume all over his feet. As abhorrent as that is to Simon, Jesus says, what you're witnessing, Simon, is a depth of gratitude that is sadly beyond you. So beyond you, you actually find what she's doing repulsive. But that's what you're seeing. What you're hearing, Simon, are chains hitting the ground. What you're seeing is a woman who had been held in slavery all her life by her fear of death being released. That's what you're seeing. It's not difficult math, Simon. Someone owes Jack $50, someone else owes him $500. He forgives them both. Who loves him more? Who's happier? It's not advanced mathematics. And it's slightly reminiscent of the meal that's thrown in Jesus' honor in John chapter 12. Remember that one? Where again a woman, Mary, comes in and pours perfume over the feet of Jesus. In fact, John goes out of his way to tell us how much that perfume would have cost. And the equivalent today, in today's money, would be $30,000. 30 grand she spent on Jesus in 5 minutes. Judas objects. Matthew tells us not just Judas. Judas was speaking for all of them. They were all offended. They all had their noses put out of joint by whatever was happening there. And so Judas, all of them, hide their jealousy behind the virtue of caring for the poor. Could not that have been so? Think about the meals that could have bought. Think about the clothes that could have bought. The shelters that could have built. But as you and I know, behind every accusation is a confession, right? We usually learn that very, very late in life. These are young boys at this time. They don't know it yet. They don't understand. They haven't grasped the concept that whenever you accuse someone of something, actually you're revealing more about yourself than you are about the object of your accusation. But they had yet to learn that. But in any event, the response from Jesus is similar. Judas, just because you don't love me the way she is loving me right now, and just because you won't love me to that degree, just because she actually appreciates my value and you don't, you think it's a waste. Leave her alone. Leave her alone. But the meals, the shelters, the clothing, and Jesus responds with what we call common vernacular. Woulda, shoulda, coulda, boys. Because I'm actually more interested in what she did do than what you might have done. So what is really going on in these two stories? What's really happening with these two perfume pourers? In one camp, the girl is surrounded by the Pharisaical crowd. In the other camp, she's surrounded by the hand-chosen disciples of Jesus. And both of them have their noses out of joint. What's going on there? It's not difficult to see what's going on there. They were exposed. They were shown up. Worse by a woman. Worse by a sinful woman. And exposed in the most horrific manner they could think of. By loving him more than they were. And they didn't like it. And when we don't like these things, when we get exposed, we like to shift the blame. Usually as quickly as possible. Me? What about the woman? Me? What about the serpent? It's always Genesis. But, and this is what I'm driving at this morning, the response that Jesus typically aroused from people, the response that Jesus solicited from these people, this over-exuberant, socially awkward, often embarrassing moments that if you put yourself, you would imagine those, and exposing everyone else around them for not having similar joy. Of course, they weren't trying to do that. They weren't wanting to. They were just excited over what they had. But what that does is that it instantly exposes everybody else who have equal reason to be excited, but who are not. What do we do when we find those who are behaving in a manner that we know we should? What do we do when we find those behaving or reacting in a manner or doing what we know we should be doing? What happens that day when the disciples turn up and the lowest rung on the societal ladder are all climbing and clamoring over Jesus? Probably as boisterous and as happy as children usually are. The disciples' reaction: to shoo the children away. And Jesus says, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Throwing a wet blanket over that? They're prime candidates for the kingdom. My kingdom, their DNA runs through my kingdom. What are you doing?" When the Pharisees objected to the Maccabean scene that was unfolding outside of Jerusalem that day, when the king arrives on a donkey, when Jesus mimics what Judas Maccabeus did a couple of 100 years earlier, riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, preempting Jesus. Poor Judas, he thought he was the fulfillment of the prophecy. And then he writes, what happens on that day when the people are tearing palm branches and throwing them? And what do the Pharisees say? You got to shut them up, quieten them down. And how does Jesus respond? He responds by saying, "Oh, trust me, that's the last thing you want me to do, because although you can't see it, they're actually a pressure valve on what's happening here, because if I stop that, the very stones will cry out. And how are you going to explain stones away? Easier to explain them away. I'm doing you a favor. But this excitement, this jubilation over what they had found, over what they had received, this reaction from people that must have went out through the land like ripples of excitement, all the tales getting spread far and wide. And you compare that, of course, to the churches and the Christians today. Now, I don't want to be too hard, because obviously we've lost a lot, right? Only having the written text, we've lost a lot. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. The first people to write all of this down had to take what Jesus said in Aramaic and then translate it into common Greek. And then it's only after that process has taken place, do our scholars get it? Both dead languages. And now they have to translate it into the text that we read in our Bibles as they translate it into English. For only after all of that process takes place do we actually get to read what Jesus said. So we lose something in translation. But I don't think translation is what we lose the most. I think the thing that we probably lose the most is the sense of Jesus' own personal conviction. Now, I know we can understand some of it. Some of the writers go out of their way to explain some of it, but that's the point I'm trying to make. reading a description is a far cry from actually seeing it take place and hearing the words being spoken. Personal conviction affects the voice, all the nuances of dialect, the fluctuation, the flow of speech, the expression. We miss the body language, how he held himself, how he carried himself, how confidently he stood. We miss the facial expressions, the smiles, we miss the snarls. We miss the eyebrows getting closer when he begins to rebuke people. The seriousness with which he spoke. All the hand gestures. We miss the volume. Sometimes it tells us that he raised his voice. I'm saying if it's difficult for us, and it is, but if it's difficult for us to simply read the words of Jesus, Simon and Judas heard them. They stood there as he said them, looking directly into his eyes. And I would imagine his overall demeanor. I can only imagine that his body language would have matched the tone of the severity of the speech. I speculate that more often than not, that it was probably the entirety of the scene that etched what happened and what was said onto the hearts and the minds of the apostles. The entire scene that helped them report it so clearly, so vividly to us. The things that they'd seen and heard, not just from Jesus, but the way people reacted. The reaction of the crowd when Jesus said, "Pluck out your eye." Well, what do you do? The first wave of that is hearing it for yourself. The second wave is looking around to see what everybody else thinks about it. Cut off your hand. How the crowd reacted to if someone slaps you on the cheek. Give them your other one. If someone forces you to go a mile, go 2 miles. Love your enemies. Do good to those who bless you. Pray for those who abuse you. Undoubtedly, when Jesus said words like, "Anyone who loves their father, mother, wife, child, brother, sister more than me is not worthy of me," the second after that hit you, you would be looking around, hoping to see a similar face that's doing something like that, to let you know that you'd actually heard it correctly. But when all the dust had settled, and all the notorious sinners had left his side weeping with gratitude or dancing with joy, and the questions were being asked, what happened? What did we just witness? What just happened? People who had been held in slavery all their life by their fear of death had been released. That's what happened. Tell me, has Christ done anything more significant for you than on that day when he came to you, terrified, afraid of death, and whispered into your ear, "You never have to worry about that ever again"? Has he done anything of more significance to you? Isn't that what makes the cross so magnificent? Isn't that what gets us on our feet cheering as we witness him dragging death along the road to Golgotha? Isn't that what excites us? When we see him dragging death, death that terrified us, death that bullied us, death that held us in slavery, isn't that what makes the cross so magnificent? Watching him dragging death along, kicking and screaming, whimpering and pleading and begging like a beaten dog, snarling at it and holding death up against the cross, and Christ hammering the nails into death's hands. Isn't that what makes us happy? Oh, I know the biblical text tells us that what happened was the other way around, that it was actually death dragging Christ along the road. It was death that held Christ up against the cross, and it was death that killed Jesus. But after Jesus died and resurrected, and we finally managed to wrap our heads around it, and people like Paul came along, they told us the exact opposite happened that day. That by his death, he destroyed him who held the power of death. That's why we don't weep around the cross. It's not our Lord that died. It's death that died. Your bully, your tyrant, your jailer. Anyone who has come to Christ and who is still afraid of death, not the act of dying, death and what lies beyond. Anyone who's come to Christ and yet remains afraid is choosing to be tied to the chains that he arrived to set you free from. Any Christian that still remains afraid of death, it's like sitting in the cell after the gate's been opened. You can do it. I don't know why anyone does it. Robert De Niro in The Mission, a great movie. One of the most wonderful scenes in cinematic history. Robert De Niro plays a Portuguese soldier back in the day when the Spanish and the Portuguese were traveling to South America to rape the land of everything that they could get out of it, every precious stone, every mineral, and the tribes, just brushing the tribes aside and slaughtering them. De Niro starts the movie as a Portuguese soldier, but something happens along the way, and De Niro's character reverses and repents, and he ends up beginning to work for the tribes and help the tribes. But during that process, when he makes the shift, De Niro chooses to carry behind him a huge net filled with all the implements of war, everything he used against those people. His sword, his spear, his breastplate, his clothes, his helmet. He chose as his penance, he's Catholic of course, so as his penance in a huge net, dragging it behind all the other tribes people. They're all scaling the mountain like goats. You can imagine trying to drag a net like that through the Amazon rainforest. It's getting snagged and everything. More often than not, he's on his face, down in the mud. Up he gets, he's pulling it, because he's obviously wanted to display his remorse, his sorrow for what he had done. And at one point in the movie, the tribespeople are watching him, probably a little bit annoyed by now that he's slowing them up. Although I'm sure they appreciate the gesture. And they watch him for a moment, and then one of the tribesmen jumps down and pulls out his knife and cuts the rope that De Niro's holding onto the net, and the net falls away and eventually settles at the bottom. One of the most beautiful scenes in cinematic history. Everything that you used to sin against us, I've now freed you from. De Niro looks at the tribesman, looks at the net, and off he goes back down the mountain to pick it up again and press on. I don't know what you do with that. They had literally and personally cut off his sin. He just chose not to live like it. They had fully forgiven him. He just chose not to live like it. He cut off his chains and he put them back on. They opened his cell door and he shut it again. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know why anyone, having been freed from cancer, for example, would schedule the next visit to the doctor to try and get some more. It makes no sense. Of course, I'm speaking about things and people that are not limited to Hollywood. I've met people like this. My mother used to say they're never happy unless they're miserable. I don't know what it is. I know it's bad theology that produces a lot of it. Theology that would like to convince us that our eternity is always on something of a knife edge, which is a horrendous, horrendous way to view the character of God. That's what he would do. Hold you temptingly over the fire. That's not a father, that's a tyrant. But apparently, Jesus met some very, very religious people who had never yet found the God of all joy. And then he found some very unreligious people who found it like that. I'll have some of that, please, and twice on Sunday. And I think that's the difference. Some people find religion because it's religion they're looking for. And they then fail to see the beauty and the joy in life because they don't see it in their faith, because they don't see it in their religion. Their religion, of course, is the lens by which they'll view everything else. So if that's miserable, if the very first lens you choose to look at life through is miserable, unhappy, fearful, you're hardly going to be skipping down the road. We must pursue Him. Him. Not the book. As irreplaceable, I mentioned it last week. As invaluable as it is, and it is. If it was the last one on earth, I quite imagine I would lay my life down for a book. That's how important that I think this book is. But at the end of the day, it's only a sign. It's pointing to someone. And if we get stuck around the sign and never progress to the one it's actually pointing to, and the things that we do, the religious things that we do, again, irreplaceable, beyond expression. The wonderful thing you're doing this morning, getting out of your bed in weather like this to assemble and tell God you love Him. But to get here and then think that this is what it's about. No. Everything in here, the prayer, the song, they're all pointing to someone. Sometimes we miss the wonder. We no longer walk through the door and see the table and are immediately startled by the reminder, oh, that's right, he's here. He's here. Which is what it says, right? I'm here. I'm with you. We got to find him. If you're here this morning and you don't know this God that I'm talking about, the God who wants your fear gone, wants your eternity secure, absolutely secure, if for no other reason than you can spread his message in the manner in which it should be spread. If you'd like to know more about him, I'm available all the time, anytime. If I'm a little frightening, and I know some preachers are, I don't speak at this level one-on-one, just in case you were wondering. I'm a lot quieter in a living room sometimes. But there's more than me. Other people in here, in fact, there's other people in here, may well be, probably are, farther along the road than I am in certain areas of Christianity, who'd be able to help you more. And I know I can speak for them and tell you that everybody in here would be able to help you in that regard. If God spares me and I'm here for a number of years, if all I ever accomplished while among you was to help you not be afraid when your day comes, I would have considered that a success. Him who by his death destroyed him, who held those who are in fear of death all their lives in slavery. Lots of people. 4 Gospels. We got 4 Gospels full of it. People leaving Jesus. Not just people coming to Jesus, but people leaving Jesus. Some people left Jesus really offended. Some people left him disappointed. Some people left him sad. And others, they could not have their joy contained, even after he expressly asked them not to say anything. I want to be that guy. That's the kind of disobedience I want to have before God. God richly bless you this morning, especially for coming out in a morning like this. You lifted my heart, every one of you.